Well, we're still waiting for our speaker, but let's get started with some announcements. First of all, it's a real pleasure to have you all here in person and online. It's fantastic to have you all here in this, what appears almost a spring day. You can feel that spring is almost here when in the mornings you wake up and you start listening to the birds. Then you go back in the afternoon and the lawn mowers start making their noise. And when the Rocky Mountain Map Society puts its great first lecture of the season, you know spring is here. And we're going to have a great talk tonight. It's one of those topics that we map lovers really enjoy. That's borders. Sometimes borders are natural. Sometimes they are peaceful. Some other created in a very contentious way, as you will learn from tonight's speaker. But before we do that, and talking about contentious, we're going to have our annual meeting on April 12th. And on that meeting, there's two important things happening. Dues are due. That very steep $25 membership rate that we have. And if you don't like that, you can always complain, because that same day is the election of our new board of directors. So if you don't like him, you can always kick him out. Or if you, what's at the 12th, April 12th, yeah. And if you like him, that's okay. If you don't like the president, that's fine. You can get rid of him. Actually, you don't have to wait that long. Today's March 15th. Is the Ides of March. So hopefully you don't get rid of him so violently like it happened with another president, another emperor, actually, a while back. But with that, that day also we're going to have another lecture. But in order to give us details of our program, we have our dynamic program director, Naomi, that is going to tell us a little bit about what's coming up. And then later on, we'll introduce the speaker. And I'm sure it's going to happen the moment you start ready to introduce, she's going to start coming in. So we'll time it. Okay. Go for it. Oh, yeah, you need the mic. Go.
Kevin, is this working? Is this working? You think so? Okay, great. Sorry for the delay, everyone. I think you all heard about the accident on 36, and our speaker told me she was on the way when she was driving, so hopefully she'll be here soon. Just to let you know, our next program is April 12th at 5:30 here at History Colorado. Kevin, do you think we'll be back in the other room, or will it be this room?
I think so. It could be posted. We might get other rooms as well.
Okay, I'll try to let everyone know before next month which room we're going to be in next time. The next speaker is going to be Michael Willis. He is a professor in CU Geosciences and the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, and he'll speak about looking at the Greenland ice sheet through time, from the ground, the air, and from space. He'll address the history of its mapping from the early 20th century to the present. Dr. Willis notes that the Greenland ice sheet is the largest body of ice in the Northern Hemisphere. If the ice sheet were to completely melt, global sea level would rise about 7 meters. Please join us to learn how the Greenlandic environment is changing. You may also look forward to the Joint Map Society's talks. They're hosted by Washington Map Society, and we help prepare some of those. Those will continue through June. And I'll send out email reminders about the rest of their schedule for the spring programming that you can attend via Zoom. All right.
Well, she's not here, and you talked about an ice sheet. I just gotta say something.
Okay.
All of you that love exploration.
Oh, here you go.
Climate change has its also its good things, and probably you learned that last week. The Endurance, this is the ship from Shackleton, was discovered in almost perfect conditions because of climate change. If not, we wouldn't have been able to do that. So it was a great discovery. We will probably learn more through National Geographic, but even the letters, the gold letters of the ship were found. So probably you learn about that. It was an incredible thing, and Shackleton survived that expedition. So it was something good for those that love exploration. So I just have to say, when you say it, actually, that's going to be Greenland, but this is way down south. But so we'll be back in a moment with the speaker. I'm sure that she's coming almost right now. Is she?
interested in this whole question of partition and what happened. I have a 2-paragraph item out of a book that I plan to read after the speaker has finished, but because she's delayed, I thought I would read it in advance just to help fill in the time. So I think it's hard to realize how brutal this whole partition business was when India and Pakistan separated. So here is a book by Patrick French, a reputed author, writing about an interview he had with an elderly Sikh gentleman in Delhi. I think this is probably 15 or 20 years ago when he was doing this. And he heard a story from this gentleman that I think we ought to know. Patrick French says, what happened next was lived with Bir Bahadur Singh ever since. Tears came down his face and he turned his head away to one side as he described, 60 years on, how his father had prayed to the Sikh gurus. Seeing that there was no way out, he's in Pakistan with his group of Sikh village, and they are trying to escape to India, but they are surrounded in a Muslim area, and there is antagonism between these groups. Seeing there was no way out, he would sacrifice the vulnerable before being killed himself. Knowing the girls had faced abduction, rape, and forced conversion, Bir Bahadur Singh's father took his kirpan, his sword. A laborer confronted him and asked to be killed because he had swollen knees and would not be able to run. The laborer was beheaded. Another old man came and said to him, do you think I will allow Muslims to cut this beard of mine and make me go to Lahore as a sheikh? For this reason they kill me. So he too was killed. Now Bir Bahadur Singh's father approached his own daughter, Man. My father said, Man beta, come here. She was 18 or 19 years old, 2 years older than me. She sat down and my father raised his sword, but it didn't strike properly. My sister lifted her plate over her head and my father angrily pulled his scarf back and brought down his sword, and her head rolled away. My uncles started beheading. All you could hear was the cut, cut, cut sound. They just chanted God's name. Nobody ran away and nobody screamed. 25 women and girls were killed in this Haveli, in this one village. Nearly all of the men died too, including Bir Bahadur Singh's father, but the son escaped to tell the story. That's how brutal it was.
My name is Wes Brown, and I am on the board of the International Map Collector Society, IMCOS for short. And the IMCOS has a wonderful journal. And another thing they do every year is have an international symposium where they go to a different country in the world. And we start with a big reception the first night, and then there's 3 days of lectures in the morning, excursions in the afternoon, drinking and having fun in the evening. And then usually there's a post-symposium trip that many of the members go on. And this conference uses maps to learn all about that country. So all the lectures are about that country, and they're quite fundamental. It's designed for people who do not know anything about New Zealand or, Netherlands or wherever you happen to be. They're assuming you don't have to have great expertise like the locals. And it's just fantastic. This year, the conference, about every 5 years, it comes to North America. And this year it will be in Dallas, near Dallas at the University of Texas in Arlington. It's a fall program. And the whole theme will be the mapping of the Southwest and the history of the Southwest. And there are all kinds of really interesting lectures like cattle and the impact of cattle is told through maps, but really about the cattle industry, or the whole Spanish elements and all the Mexican-American War and the Alamo and all these kind of things. So if you are interested in this, please let me know. We will send out announcements because we're an affiliate with the International Map Collectors Society. It occurs at the beginning of October. And then there's a 5-day extravaganza trip where we're going to several of the great cities in Texas to learn. The funnest thing about an IMCOS meeting, if any of you have been there, and I know some have, most of the people there are not Americans. And so, but they all speak English. And so it's so fun to be getting to know these people, having dinner, lunch, lectures, sitting on buses together with these people from all over the world who are having the same passion and interest that you have. So that will be in early October, and keep your eye out. And if any of you are interested in a great time, this is something you could do. That's a short flight.
So with your limited knowledge of the Southwest, are you going to be there?
I will be there. I'm what's called the international chairman. So it's my job to work with the country that's hosting this and help them set it up. So I have been to about 25 countries. I mean, from South America to Anchorage, South Africa to Anchorage, and they've Singapore and Tokyo, and you name it. It just is so fascinating. Budapest, it just bounces from what next year will be Finland. It just bounces around from one country to the other. Most of these places I knew very, very little about, and you leave after a week, with quite a knowledge and a wonderful experience. So here's your chance to maybe get hooked to the group and then use it as an opportunity to travel elsewhere. This one will be easy this year. Jim.
Unusual map collections that are not open to the public. Sometimes they're private, sometimes they're government, but there are places like Windsor Castle that you just don't get into on your own.
That's right. Our the person from the audience said that the host committee finds ways for all the attendees to see extraordinary things that you would never be able to see on your own. For example, in Texas, we're going to the day before the day of the conference opening in the evening, we're going to the ranch of Reese Jones, who's some fabulous billionaire who has this huge ranch that's 90,000 acres or something, and is this renowned library and home, and everybody wants to go there, but they'll only accept 30 people. So they're going to not allow any Texans to go until all the out of staters and out of countryers get first dibs. But for example, we saw when we had one in London, they arranged for a map conference in Windsor to see the royal collection in Windsor Castle. And we were only the 4th time a map group had ever been brought in as a group to see that before. They limited it to 25 people. But anyhow, there've been many episodes just like that. Thanks, Jim.
Oh, I was gonna save this till next month because it hooks in really nicely with what Michael Willis is going to talk about. But right now we have this wonderful exhibition up in my library, which is Earth Sciences and Map Library at CU, and it's called Sensing Ice, and it's a bunch of glacier photography and videography from drones and being in person by someone who just finished his PhD in the environmental studies program. It's wonderful. It's so beautiful and people love to be in it. He wants it to be like a full immersive experience. So there's also music that was recorded on glaciers with a symphony that he contracted for. So if you want to visit, we'd love to see you. I didn't bring these cards. Next time we're here, I'll bring some cards. So even if you can't come, you can download the music and listen to the glacier music. He was just, I don't know if you saw this, he was on 9 News last night. We actually had 9 News come and they interviewed him He's an adventurer. He got a grant to go to Greenland and to tromp around on the glaciers and do a bunch of filming and write about it. And it's just a wonderful exhibit. It'll be up through December. So there's plenty of time to come see it. So that's what's going on in our library at the moment. Aside from we opened again after COVID, there's a lot of students. We have a lot of classes coming in. And in the map library world, we hear from people that there's a huge interest, obviously, in Ukraine mapping. Where do you find it? We've ordered a whole bunch of it's a Soviet, it's like these reprints of Soviet maps of Ukraine and areas around there. So they're supposed to come in any day now if people want to research with those. I'm trying to think what else is going on in the map world. Yes. With the other societies. I'd have to like look at this schedule. Yes, you can. Yeah, let me find what Ron has said about that. Hang on a sec. I will tell you what's coming up with the joint societies. Sorry, the wireless is a little slow. Nope. Okay. No, I think I might hear somebody. Sorry, you all. She's here. All right. I'll send out emails about all these programs coming up. Okay. Yay. Okay. Well, let me introduce her, Lucy Chester, while you're waiting for her. I'm sure it's going to be probably a little bit flustered. That was a heck of a drive today. So tonight's talk is called The Geographic Imagination of Pakistan. Lucy Chester has been at CU for quite a while. I think we worked with her in the map library back in 2012 or so for the first time. She's an associate professor of history and international affairs at CU Boulder. She teaches courses on British imperialism, nationalism, and anti-colonialism. Her classes focus on South Asia in a transnational context with attention to the Middle East and Africa. And she's the author of a book called Borders and Conflict in South Asia, the Radcliffe Boundary Commission and the Partition of Punjab. She is currently revising a book manuscript to be published with Oxford University Press on connections between British India and the Palestine Mandate in the decades leading up to Britain's withdrawal. She's also beginning a new project on geographical imaginings of Pakistan. And this talk that you're going to hear tonight is part of her new project, building on the book Borders and Conflict in South Asia. All right, and here she is. Hello. Must have been right behind the tractor trailer.
I think I timed it as badly as possible. I've never seen it that bad.
Yep. Oh, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, great. Hi, Kevin. Thank you. All right, can folks hear me okay? The microphone? Audio is good though? Okay, great. It's lovely to be here. Better late than never. We have been told that we live in a borderless world, but we're seeing these days with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fierce Ukrainian resistance that demography and territory. Sorry, folks, lost you for a sec. Demography and territory and boundaries do indeed matter, and that these boundary lines are often still drawn in blood. And we're seeing that it's often innocent people who bear the brunt of high politics and imperial ambition. What I want to do today is to direct our attention to another part of the world that has seen nearly a century of debate and then tension and then even open conflict tied to these questions of population and territory and borderlines, and that is India and Pakistan. Now, it's important to note that these are not ancient conflicts, that they are very much rooted in the assumptions and influence of the British Empire. Can I get my next slide? So what I'll do today is trace the development of tension between Hindus and Muslims in India, then look at calls for a separate state for India's Muslims, move into debates, particularly in the 1930s and also the 1940s, about the creation of this separate state, which came to be known as Pakistan, and then talk about the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan. And throughout, I'm going to emphasize the role played by maps. So the British Empire contributed in really fundamental ways to Hindu, Muslim, and then Indo-Pakistani conflict, in part because British colonizers really fundamentally misunderstood Indian religion, society, and borders. And this was in part because their own society at home in Britain was so stratified that they perceived division, religious division, economic division, social division, et cetera, as fundamental to all societies, including Indian society. And those perceptions became reality in many ways. Perhaps most dramatically in the 1947 partition of the Indian Empire into two new states, India and Pakistan. So one of the main themes of my talk today is the way that imaginings and understandings and misunderstandings can shape the reality of our world. And in particular, about the ways that assumptions about lines between religious groups can actually end up determining lines on a map. In 1857, a diverse group of Indians rose up against British control, motivated by a range of economic and military and political and religious grievances. They included Muslims and Hindus and other groups. But the British perceived this 1857 uprising as led primarily by Muslims. And they took it as proof that Muslims were inherently violent and untrustworthy. And this contributed to a long-lasting set of British ideas about fundamental differences between Muslims and other Indian religious groups, particularly Hindus. Among other things, British colonial leaders developed what we now refer to as divide and rule, an approach that involved pitting colonized groups against each other in order to distract them from joining together and throwing off colonial control. Hindus were a large majority of the population of India in 1901. Hindus were about 70%. Muslims were about 21% of the population, so a significant minority, but still very much a minority. And other religious groups were there in much smaller numbers. Buddhists about 3%, Sikhs about 1%. In the early 20th century, the British colonial state began very slowly and grudgingly to expand access to representative government. And as it did so, it encouraged Muslim leaders to request special political protections. And in response to these so-called requests, British officials established, among other things, a system of separate electorates. which is a very interesting and really profoundly undemocratic idea, which held that only Muslims should vote for Muslim leaders because only Muslim leaders could represent Muslim interests. So one key point here is that the development of political boundaries between Muslims and other groups in India, and also the timing of this development to the late 1800s and early 1900s. So this is something that developed during a specific historical period. It's sometimes presented as in other parts of the world as sort of ancient hatreds. These people have always been this way, they've always fought each other this way. But in fact, this is something that's rooted in a really specific historical period developing in response to very particular circumstances. Tensions between Hindus and Muslims increased during the first decades of the 20th century, especially. There were riots, there were occasional episodes of violence during this period. And when Mahatma Gandhi's anti-colonial nationalist campaign took off in the 1920s and especially in the 1930s, many Muslims, not all, but many Muslims felt alienated by some of the rhetoric and symbolism that Gandhi used, which is ironic because what Gandhi was advocating was secular, inclusive nationalism. But in doing so, he drew on Hindu symbols, for example, invoking the sacrifices of the goddess Sita, and he advocated political arrangements that left many Muslims fearful that they would be swamped in a Hindu majority independent India. So the 1930s became a period of increasing tension and separation between Hindus and Muslims. So now we come to the idea of a separate state or states for Indian Muslims. Next slide, please. This is Muhammad Iqbal. Beginning in the early 1930s, Muslim leaders in India discussed the possibility of creating a separate Muslim state. At that point, a small, marginal, elitist Muslim political party known as the Muslim League began to articulate this notion of a separate homeland, beginning in 1930, when the Muslim League president, poet, and philosopher named Muhammad Iqbal gave a speech in which he said, among other things, quote, "I would like to see the Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, Sindh, and Baluchistan amalgamated into a single state." Next slide, please. Ooh. Can we maybe dim the lighting a bit? This is the darkest slide, so it's only going to get better from here. Oh, that's better. Okay. Well, as you may or may not be able to see here, Iqbal is talking about this area here in northwestern India. So Iqbal did not provide or refer to a map, but we can see in this, actually next slide, please, particularly in this detail of this map from 1930, roughly the area that he had in mind. We can also see on this map, you can see all these various divisions, including areas like here that are actually princely states. The British only directly controlled about 1/3 of India. A full 2/3 of India, they ruled indirectly through these so-called princely states, which were ruled in all the areas that the British didn't care about by princes or hereditary rulers. So these princely states are another layer of division on India's political landscape. Now, Iqbal suggested that the colonial boundaries, the colonial administrative boundaries of these various provinces might need to be altered, quote, so as to secure comparatively homogeneous communities possessing linguistic, racial, cultural, and religious unity. So overall, what Iqbal was offering in 1930 was a fairly specific geographical description of the Muslim state he envisioned. Although the political nature of this state was less clear. Was this going to be a state as in Colorado, a state within a federal structure like the USA? Was it going to be an independent state? at this point, there wasn't much specific discussion about the political nature of this entity. Mainly, Iqbal highlighted the importance of this new state having a predominantly Muslim population. So he's thinking about demographics here. This statement in 1930 really had very little effect immediately on the policy of the Muslim League, let alone the larger colonial regime. But in later years, many observers cited it as a significant point on the path to Pakistan. Next slide, please. And actually, if I could have it a little more light, there'll be a few minutes. So here we have another key figure, Chaudhry Ramat Ali. Now, Iqbal did not use the term Pakistan. That word was actually coined in 1933 by this man. Ramat Ali was an Indian Muslim, but spent most of his life in exile in Britain. He imagined Pakistan long before it came into existence. And Pakistan, when you're ready, sorry, next slide. Pakistan, the word Pakistan is a really fascinating term. It's a neologism that means Pakistan, Pak being the Urdu word for pure, so the land of the pure, Pakistan, the land of the pure. But it is also an acronym. This is the really cool part. That these days is usually interpreted as P for Punjab, A for Afghanistan, or maybe the Northwest Frontier Province, K for Kashmir, S for Sindh, and then Tan from the Stan and Baluchistan. Ramat Ali also foresaw and endorsed what later came to be known as the hostage theory. And I'm going to come back to the hostage theory because it is unfortunately really central here. So the hostage theory was the idea that the safety of Muslims in India would be guaranteed by the presence of Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan. Because each government would be compelled to protect its own minority population for fear that if it did not, its own minority co-religionists across the boundary would be in danger. And the hostage theory developed into a central element of the Muslim League's campaign for Pakistan. Now, Ramat Ali is particularly interesting for our purposes because he had an extraordinary cartographic imagination. And over the course of his campaign for the creation of Pakistan, which began in 1933 and ran up through 1951, after it had already come into existence, he created dozens of maps of this country, which did not yet exist. Next slide, please. He even drew the map of Pakistan, which didn't yet exist, back into ancient history, as we see in this selection. So here we have Pakistan at the dawn of history. Next slide, please. So he was claiming not only that Pakistan already existed, but that it had existed for millennia. And here we have Pakistan beginning, this is just a selection. There are more maps that he created. Pakistan at various periods, including, so this is at the height of the Mughal Empire. This is when the Mughal Empire begins to, or when it's very much in decline, and then bringing it up to Pakistan in 1933. But Ramat Ali was exceptional in this focus on maps. His emphasis on maps was very much the exception at this stage. So Pakistan was still a pretty complicated geographical idea that was not yet taking on cartographic form. Next slide, please. March 1940 saw a crucial development in the Muslim League's campaign for political protections for Muslims. The now president of the League, this man, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, called for the division of India into, quote, autonomous national states. Again, there's this lack of clarity about what kind of state he actually means. And this is still a subject of debate among historians to this day. The following day, the delegates at the Muslim League annual meeting passed a resolution demanding the formation in northwestern and in eastern India of, quote, independent states, autonomous and sovereign. again, still fairly vague, constituted of, quote, geographically contiguous units, end quote, in which Muslims were a majority. And it called for, quote, such territorial readjustments as may be necessary. This declaration came to be known as the Lahore Resolution, the city in which the meeting was held, and it marked the Muslim League's first official call for a separate state. And this state was as yet unnamed. Jinnah never used the term Pakistan in the early 1940s, but it quickly came to be known as the Pakistan Demand. So I'm going to move now to talking about criticisms of the Lahore Resolution and Pakistan Demand. But I do want to note that from a fairly early stage, the hostage theory was seen even by the Muslim League's own senior leaders as fundamental to this proposal. Chaudhry Khaliluzzaman wrote, quote, one of the basic principles lying behind the Pakistan idea is that of keeping hostages in Muslim provinces, as against the Muslims in the Hindu provinces. If we allow millions of Hindus to go out of our orbit of influence, the security of the Muslims in the minority provinces will greatly be minimized. So in other words, we can't allow these Hindu minorities to leave because they are our guarantee of the safety of our co-religionists in these Muslim minorities. So for Khaliluzzaman, it was important not just to have Hindu minorities in this new state of Pakistan, but to prevent them from migrating to India. And he laid out this model in conversation with many people, including British officials at the time, who even then noted that this whole hostage theory depended on retaliation. So the 1940 Lahore Resolution drew on Rahmat Ali's work, although it didn't acknowledge it at all, both in its articulation of geographical separatism and in this dependence on the hostage theory. It did not, however, adopt his emphasis on maps. The League did not issue any maps after the meeting, and few, if any, Indian newspapers included maps in their explanations of what it meant. There are a couple of cartographic images that are really the exceptions that prove the rule that newspaper coverage did not at this point employ maps to help readers understand the geographic meaning of the Lahore Resolution. So this is a cartoon that appeared in a newspaper that was largely, I don't want to say anti-Muslim League, but had a different political leaning than the Muslim League. And what you see here, I know the quality of this reproduction is bad, but there's a whole group of diners seated at a table. We see Jinnah, this tall, distinctive figure here standing at one end of the table. He's holding a large knife, and there's a globe, which is labeled India, in front of him. And the various diners or would-be diners at the table are labeled. We have here untouchables, for example. We have various Muslim sects. We have Hindus. We have Sikhs. We have Dravids from South India. And here we have opportunists and nobodies. And so Jinnah is clearly preparing to slice up this globe and to serve out territorial portions to these various groups. So in the early 1940s, cartography more frequently served as a vehicle for criticizing the Muslim League call for a Muslim state than as a means of explaining it or supporting it. And the lack of cartographic material in the demand for Pakistan is all the more striking, given that there was actually a plethora of maps of Pakistan that preceded the Lahore Resolution of 1940. Next slide, please. So the late 1930s had actually seen a spate of cartographic discussions of this idea. Here are a couple from 1939. And this was created by Mian Kifayat Ali, an advocate of the Pakistan idea. So what this tells us is that the non-cartographic nature of the Muslim League proposal was deliberate, that it was a conscious choice. It very much stands in contrast not only to what Rahmat Ali was doing, but also to public discourse in India in the late 30s and especially early 1940s. Especially as we get farther into World War II, coverage of international affairs, wartime events, political propaganda, and even advertisements commonly featured maps. The influential cartographic historian Brian Harley has written, quote, "Silence can reveal as much as it conceals." And Harley's focus was blank space and other forms of silence on the map itself. This case is slightly different because it involves a lack of maps, a choice not to use cartographic modes of persuasion. And I would argue that this is because what the Muslim League was trying to do in 1940 was to rally a very diverse community behind the idea of a Muslim state. So Muslims in South Asia were then and are today incredibly diverse, economically, religiously, socially, culturally, in every way that you can think of. So the whole idea of Pakistan would be most effective as a symbol if all of these various Muslim communities were able to interpret it in a different way, if they were all able to imagine themselves as being part of that Pakistan. The historian Yasmin Khan notes, quote, "The strength of the appeal of Pakistan was in its evocation of many contradictory ideas, from utopian dreams to hard material calculus. And maps imply precision and clarity, even if this promise, as we know, is often an illusion. And any kind of precision could potentially alienate supporters of the Muslim League. So the language of the Lahore Resolution, in particular, its promise of territorial readjustments, was calculated to appeal to the widest possible audience. The Muslim League was grappling with a whole range of geographical possibilities, proposals, in many cases, so contradictory and confusing that they couldn't be reduced to a single official map. So criticism of Pakistan began very early in 1940, the same year as the Lahore Resolution. A leader of the Indian National Congress Party, this was Gandhi's party, the party of secular nationalism that advocated a unified India, warned that even after the creation of Pakistan, quote, "The minority problem in Punjab, that is Northwest India, and Bengal, Northeast India, will also remain the same. What then is the object of cutting the body into two?" And this criticism was a key theme in reactions to the Muslim League's Pakistan proposal. Opponents of Pakistan argued that separate states would not solve this minority problem. Next slide, please. The great untouchable leader, B.R. Ambedkar, leader of the community now known as Dalits, sought to deconstruct the Pakistan idea, which he opposed. Here we have this in the next slide, please, from his 1941 book, which is a really thorough analysis of the whole Pakistan idea. Next slide. Here we have another critique from 1942. And a lot of these critiques used maps, and they did so often to convey to the reader that these were not coherent pieces of territory, that they could not cohere, that they didn't make sense geographically. So most of these critics were advocates of a united India. They argued that geographical divisions couldn't be a solution to cultural divisions. Next slide, please. Rahman Ali comes back into our story now. He too criticized the Lahore Resolution as inadequate. And by this time, his cartographic thinking was expanding dramatically. In the early 1940s, he imagined not just Pakistan, but now 3 Muslim states, Pakistan carved out of Northwest India, a separate state, Bangi Islam, in Northeast India, and Usmanistan in the center. And this is the princely state of Hyderabad, which was a very large state in the center of India. And we'll come back to Hyderabad in a bit. Also in the 1940s, in the early 1940s, perhaps in response to this flowering of anti-Pakistan maps, the Muslim League very slowly began to offer maps of its own. Next slide, please. So here we have another cartoon. I'm not sure turning the lights down is going to help because this is just a bad quality reproduction. But this is from 1943. The old Viceroy Linlithgow was leaving and handing over control to the new Viceroy Wavell. This is Linlithgow with a passport to London sticking out of his pocket. Wavell, who is just coming from well, a number of military positions. General Wavell has a whole bunch of different hats. He's got various military hats. At the very top, he's got the viceregal crown, sort of, balancing precariously. Here we have a representative of the Indian National Congress who's clearly thinking about putting a Gandhi cap, one of the symbols of Gandhian nationalism, at the very top of the heap. And in the center of the image, we have a map of an upside down India. Suggesting that everything seems to have been turned upside down, but notably not mentioning Pakistan as all. So Dawn, this newspaper, was the mouthpiece of the Muslim League. This is the party newspaper. But even 3 years after the Lahore Resolution, when it does move to a cartographic vein, it's still not doing so specifically in response to, or as a way to convince its readers of the need for Pakistan. Next slide. So this is the first real map of Pakistan that Dawn publishes. So this isn't until 1944. So this is about 4.5 years after the Lahore Resolution. And you can see that this map in particular is designed to convey an impression of demographic unity, to say this is an area of a solid Muslim majority. So you can contrast it to what Ambedkar and other critics had been saying in the early 1940s. Next slide, please. Here we have another interesting map from 1944, created by the East Pakistan Renaissance Society. And you can see that it uses different visual techniques, arguably, well, more detailed, but less effective, to try to convey a sense of to parse the relationship between Muslim majority districts and Hindu majority districts in Northeast India. And this idea of the East Pakistan Renaissance Society or Rebirth Society is really fascinating, because we're still dealing with a country that doesn't yet exist. But it resonates with Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's effort to write Pakistan back into several millennia of history. Next slide, please. Speaking of Rahmat Ali, here he is again. Although he had earlier endorsed the hostage theory, Rahmat Ali was now appalled by the idea of leaving large Muslim populations in India, which he recognized would be the inevitable result of the kind of Pakistan that Jinnah was proposing. And so Rahmat Ali is still spinning out these increasingly complex proposals, which now gave a separate independent state to every area of South Asia that had a concentrated Muslim population. And then, so here again, this is the Hyderabad area. And then within those Muslim states, leaving room for enclaves for Hindu populations. And one of the striking elements of this map is the way that the green colored Muslim states really visually dominate the much smaller Hindu lands. The Muslim League remained reluctant to use maps to support its campaign. And this reluctance contrasts not just with Rahmat Ali's work. And here I have to admit that Rahmat Ali is way, way out there on the spectrum of people using fantastical maps for nationalist means, but also with other areas of Indian Muslim life, which was not at all map phobic. Next slide, please. So a couple of times I've mentioned Hyderabad. Here we have one of the princesses, daughters of the Nizam of Hyderabad, who is fabulously wealthy and one of the richest men in the world, and also ruler of I think the largest princely state in India. And here, this is a photo from 1946 that shows this really extraordinary relief map on the wall of building in one of the Nizam's palaces. And one of the interesting things about this map is that this is very much a map of greater India. You know, it extends into what we would call the Middle East and up into China and the north. And it's also, as I say, it's a relief map. It emphasizes topographic features. This is not a map that has anything to say about political divisions. And it's certainly not a map that talks about Pakistan. So we need to understand the Muslim League's reluctance to use maps in the context of its specific political goals and political limitations. As I say, the need to offer a Pakistan that all Muslims could imagine as including them. Next slide, please. Here we have a very, very rare, possibly unique example of a pro-Pakistan political banner with a map. It features Jinnah standing in front of the map, waving a flag of waving a Pakistani flag. And what's amazing about this is that that West Pakistan is almost completely obscured by this map. And East Pakistan, the boundaries of East Pakistan are completely ambiguous because Jinnah himself is blocking the view of where those boundaries might fall. So this map again offers the viewer ambiguity, whereas Rahmat Ali's maps offer ambition. Next slide, please. Rahmat Ali aspired to preserve all Muslims from Hindu domination, even if this required what one prominent Pakistani historian, the late great K.K. Aziz, calls, quote, impossible sovereignties, artificial frontiers, and impracticable transfers of population. And in fact, Rahmat Ali's cartography, although it is very much intended to support his argument for the creation of a Muslim state, expanded to a point where it emphasized the non-viability of his Pakistan and its fellow Muslim states. In 1946, and especially 1947, communal violence between Hindus and Muslims and also Sikhs shattered the League's hostage theory, or to be more precise, really revealed the grim underpinnings of the hostage theory, this fundamental logic of retaliation. Killings in the northern Punjabi city of Rawalpindi in March of 1947 that primarily targeted Sikhs sparked a cycle of retaliatory violence. Next slide, please. British leaders had absolutely refused to engage with the Pakistan idea until really about March of 1947, when they abruptly, when Wavell was replaced by this man, Dickey Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India, who did a complete 180-degree turn. While attempting to save his own face. And with the key Indian leaders, Jawaharlal Nehru here, who became the first prime minister of India. And this is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who went on to be the first primary leader of Pakistan, hammering out the details, at least in theory, for what was really a rushed and poorly planned partition. And note, of course, in the background of each shot, the large wall map of India that forms the backdrop to these very last minute negotiations. The worst violence Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs had all by this point built up attacks on one group for revenge, on purpose versa. Now the whole posterior is way and orderly. Of already on the move, millions of people. We're talking 10, 12 more million people, particularly if you take the longer term view, fled across these new boundaries. So Muslims fled to Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs fled to India. Next slide, please. And these boundaries were still almost completely unmarked. Most refugees only knew that they had arrived in something approaching safety when they made it to a city that they knew was in their new home, or when they crossed a major natural barrier like a river. So these is actually now one of the major crossing points between India. This next photo is the only one that existed purely in the geographic imagination for nearly 2 decades now meant numbers are hard to pin down, but most scholars at this point would say it was between 1 to 2 million people who died in the partition violence. And up to a total of about 17 million people who were forced into exile one way or another. So I don't at all want to minimize what's happening in Ukraine, but just to put it into relative perspective, the most recent numbers I've heard from Ukraine are 3 million refugees, which is a shocking, extraordinary number that is in some ways dwarfed by the number of people who were forced to flee on very short notice in India and Pakistan. So the hostage theory found its logical culmination in this spiral of retaliatory used at the time, cleansing of the Muslim population from Indian Punjab and the Hindu and Sikh population from Pakistani Punjab. Next slide, please. India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars since 1947, all of them over territory, most of them having to do with East Pakistan seceded. Bangladesh comes into our story. So this history shows, excuse me. India accidentally fires a missile at Pakistan, calm ensues. India, through some sort of technical error, for which I'm sure a lot of people are being fired right now, accidentally launched a cruise missile into Pakistani territory. This is everyone's Cold War nightmare come to life, right? And it actually happened last week. But Pakistan, showing remarkable restraint, did not retaliate. I'm actually getting chills just thinking about it. The missile was unarmed, thank God. It crashed without causing any injuries near a city in West Punjab. So it was launched from Ambala here, and it landed right about here. So from just north of the Indian capital to a bit south of the Pakistani capital, and no one was hurt. So this incident is another example of how much these boundaries still matter, but it's also a reminder that human restraint and common sense can prevail even in these very troubled times. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions. Yes.
Describe the separation discussed over 20 years ago. Were people voluntarily relocating as it came up?
No.
Individual families moving.
No, they really weren't. In part because, oh yes. So the question is, I've said that the Pakistan idea was being discussed over 20 years. Were people relocating? Were individual families moving at all? No, they really weren't. And this is partly because the Muslim League absolutely didn't want them to, right? This is the whole point of the hostage theory. They don't want to force Muslims to move to Pakistan. And in order to keep those Muslims safe, they definitely want to keep their Hindu and Sikh minorities in what will be Pakistani territory. So to give you an example of how convinced everyone involved was of this, Jinnah kept his house in Bombay, which is, was always going to be in India. There's no question that Bombay was ever going to go to Pakistan. He kept his house there and seems to have been completely confident that he would be able to move back and forth across the boundary. So these were true believers in the hostage theory.
How pure is the population in India versus Pakistan with the religion?
Well, let's put pure in quotes. So it's a tough question. Probably the population of India today is 13–14% Muslim. India has a population of 1.3 billion. So that's a lot of Muslims. So there is still a very large Muslim population in India. The Indian, I have to say, it's a kind of a hard question because the Indian census doesn't track religion anymore. This was one of the reactions to the end of British rule and to partition, an attempt to say religion doesn't matter. India is a secular state. All are welcome. So we're just not going to keep track of those numbers. In Pakistan, the numbers are very small. And those small populations of Hindus and Sikhs who did remain left over subsequent decades. So there are still Sikhs, very small numbers of Hindus, a number of Christians in Pakistan, but it's a difficult situation.
Can you share your thoughts about the border of West Pakistan, the Durand Line,
Yeah.
in Afghanistan, and the implications of what that means?
Yes. So this is a very interesting boundary. So this is this line here. Sorry, the question is, what are the implications of Pakistan's boundary with Afghanistan, known as the Durand Line, after the Britain who in 1896, 1897 was responsible for delineating it. So Pakistan in 1947 declared that the Durand Line was its western boundary. Afghanistan has never accepted this line. And I'll tell you the most significant thing about this line is that we've talked about divide and rule, right? So the British in India were particularly concerned. This is so fascinating. I want to make sure I lay it out clearly. I've talked about how they were concerned about Muslims as inherently violent and untrustworthy and prone to rebellion. And they thought that there were certain Muslim groups that were even more martially skilled and dangerous, including Pathans, who today live in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the Durand Line was drawn specifically to cut through the middle of the territories where Pathans lived, to try to divide Pathans into what became two separate states. And what this meant, combined with the fact that India also ruled pretty much indirectly in this zone as it did in princely states, that this boundary just didn't matter for decades and decades and decades. Arguably until the early 2000s and the US invasion of Afghanistan, when US officials looking at the map and seeing this very clear and precise line said, well, we need to enforce this line. But this is part of the reason why it was so difficult to find, for example, Osama bin Laden, that with this this Pathan community on both sides of the boundary in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, there were lots of places for Taliban fighters, including Osama bin Laden, to take shelter. And as I'm sure you know, when he was actually found, he was in Pakistan, right under the nose of the Pakistani army. You had a question?
You said near the beginning of your talk that the idea of contiguous territory is important to the ideas of the Muslim separatism. But my question is about administration. How on earth, or even did they ever think, how are they going to administrate West Pakistan and East Pakistan when they are contiguous?
Yes.
All the two growing areas and stuff.
Yes.
In the middle.
So the question is, how on earth did Pakistan's proponents think that they were going to administer both West Pakistan and East Pakistan when they didn't touch each other even remotely? So I've posed this question to my students who were like, well, Alaska. I was like, okay, you make a point. But the other answer is that this is not at all what Jinnah wanted. What Jinnah really wanted was a band all across northern India. He referred to it as a corridor, which would connect these areas with significant Muslim minorities to the Muslim majority areas on either side. But as 1971 and the secession of East Pakistan showed, religion was just not enough to hold Pakistan together. There were far too many cultural differences and economic differences. West Pakistan really profoundly exploited East Pakistan. And so East Pakistan was eager to leave. Other questions? Yes.
India has a new boundary dispute in the last couple of years when Nepal Parliament unanimously voted to add a stretch of India into Nepal in the last year. Can you say a bit about that? The Kalapani area?
I can't say a whole lot about that specifically, other than that India has certainly been concerned about Nepal for a while and has done a lot of influence, does its best to influence Nepali politics in a pro-India way. I can say that along this boundary, so especially here, there has been a lot of conflict with China and India and China fought a war in 1962, which India pretty spectacularly lost. And there have been in the last couple of years episodes where it seems to me China is largely the aggressor and is trying to move into Indian territory. So, I mean, really, a lot of these colonially imposed boundaries are still very much up for debate in the minds of the sovereign states that now border them.
Both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers.
Yes.
And do they have like a MAD program as well, like the United States and Russia, for example?
They are working on it. They have the benefit of being able to learn from US and Soviet Cold War experiences. There has also been a lot of really active US involvement behind the scenes to try to hammer out command and control issues. There was for a while, particularly with Pakistan, concern that Pakistani concerned that there wasn't a clear separation between civilian control, ultimately civilian control of decisions about nuclear weapons and the military, because in Pakistan, the military, even when there's a democratically elected ruler, is really calling the shots. And so there was concern that not only might the army actually be making these decisions, but that radical Islamist elements within the army might get their hands on nuclear weapons. And Pakistan actually did a lot of work. President Musharraf, I don't know if you remember, President Musharraf took power in a coup in the late 1990s, and was not anyone's model of a democratic leader, but he did work very hard to try to rid the top ranks of the Pakistani army of Muslim radicals. So I would say there's less concern than you might think about the possibility of a nuclear clash. In 2002, well, actually, India and Pakistan fought one war since becoming nuclear powers in 1999, the Kargil conflict. And in 2002, there was a very significant deployment of Indian troops to the Pakistani boundary. There have been a number of very worrying situations. There was actually an aerial dogfight over the boundary a couple of years ago. And then, as I say, last week, India accidentally lobbed a missile at Pakistan. And none of these has actually turned into anything approaching a nuclear conflict. So India and Pakistan are developing their own approach to deterrence. It's a different situation, of course, in the US and the Soviet Union, right, which are so far apart. If India bombs Pakistan, it's going to feel the repercussions itself if it's a nuclear bomb. So I think that helps put a damper on things. Yes.
Would you say a word about the partition? I'm confused about to what extent the government's authorities directed people or encouraged people to migrate, or was it just a stampede of fear? Help us understand that better.
I would say it was a stampede of fear. And belatedly, the governments responded. They did a couple things. They set up what were called refugee special trains. The drawback to this was that it meant that every train traveling from India to Pakistan was obviously filled with Muslim refugees, and every train coming the other way was obviously filled with Hindu and Sikh refugees. And so these militias would ambush these trains, slaughter everyone on board, leave the engineer alive to take the train across the boundary. So this is one element of this retaliatory spiral, because of course, this continued. The other thing that the British did was they put in place something called the Punjab Boundary Force, which tried to keep peace, but it was small, just completely understaffed for what it was being asked to do, and it was made up of Hindu and Muslim and Sikh soldiers, most of whom were Punjabi and were actually losing family themselves at that moment in the violence. So for many reasons, the Punjab Boundary Force was largely ineffective. Yeah.
Well, while the idea was still that you could kind of keep the minority with the hostage idea, was there any active campaigns to keep the minority people happy? Were they trying to was there any active campaigns to keep them where they were before they tried to leave?
I don't think it got that far, because the violence actually started before partition officially happened. So by the time people knew, there was a lot of uncertainty about where the boundary line would fall. So a lot of people were just saying, well, I might be in Pakistan, so I might as well stay here, or vice versa. And by the time they actually knew which side of the line they were on, the violence had already blown up. Yeah.
What is modern Great Britain's relationship to India and Pakistan? We still have units in the military, the Sikhs. What else is?
Britain has a remarkably, kind of shockingly positive relationship with India and Pakistan. I should say the Indian and Pakistani relationship is remarkably friendly towards India. When I went to India, people couldn't quite place my accent, and so they would often ask me if I was British, in this very friendly way. So one of the larger arguments I won't go into too much detail here, but what Mountbatten did, what he was trying to do with the 1947 partition was save face for Britain and try to maintain a relationship with India and Pakistan. And somehow that succeeded. So the relationship, so India and Pakistan are still members of the Commonwealth, which is largely symbolic, but that's very valuable from a British symbolic point of view. And the relationship, well, I was going to say it's largely economic, but it is also cultural as well, because there are very significant Pakistani and Indian migrant communities in Britain. And some, the Chancellor of the Exchequer right now is, the son of Indian immigrants to Britain. So there are a lot of immigrants who maintain these ties between Britain and its former colonies. Well, thank you all for your patience. It's been wonderful to be here. Thanks so much.